Time to lay up some new castings. Got a brand new 25-pound bag of Hydrocal. Got some soapy water. Got my mixing bowl. And I got 5 Bragdon molds here. So I'm going to mix up some plaster and get pouring. When mixing the plaster, I ended up mixing a lot of air into the plaster. So after I pour the plaster into my molds, I want to give the molds a good shake. And you can see all the air bubbles that come up to the top. And if I don't shake the molds vigorously, all those air bubbles will be down on the surface of the rock, and we definitely don't want that. So if you're laying up castings and you're new to it, make sure you do that with your molds after you pour in your plaster. So give them a good shake, get those air bubbles to come up to the top. I have the Hydrocal in my molds, so I'm going to let that sit up for a few hours. Now it's only going to be 106 today, which is actually a nice little cooling trend, consider it's been bouncing between 111 and 116, so 106 sounds pretty good. I'm going to let these sit outside for probably most of the day. Alright, my castings have been out in the Arizona summer heat for about 6 hours. Now you can see with this one, it's still a little bit gray over here, so there's a little bit of moisture in here. And this casting was laid up in 2 layers. But it should be good enough to pull out of the mold. Now, this is a big casting, so be a little bit careful with it. And these Bragdon molds are, some type of latex rubber. Of course, I don't know anything about rubber, but they're very flexible. I use the diluted soap as a release agent, but these molds, they're so intricate that the plaster still wants to hold on to them. You can see the incredible detail here. I just roll the mold back. Just kind of roll it out of the plaster. All right. Well, that is beautiful. And you can see by, tapping and wiggling the mold when the plaster is still real wet, that we get rid of any air bubbles. So you can see there's almost no air bubbles in this. It's a really, really nice casting. You can still see it's slightly gray right here, so there's a little bit of moisture there, but should be hard enough to take out of the mold. I'll use some of that diluted soapy water as a mold release. All right. As you can see, almost no air bubbles. So when the plaster's still very wet, very fluid, make sure we get those air bubbles up to the top, and we get rewarded with a real nice casting. It's a beautiful casting. Here's some of the castings I've recently laid up. Now, I've broken some of the larger castings up into small parts. And what I did is I kind of picked certain areas of the castings I wanted to use on the second side of the canyon. Now, all this stuff, hopefully I'll be able to use it at some point, but I won't need any more of it right now. I'm cutting foam blocks, and then I'm using hot glue to put them in place, and I'll just build up this area. You can see that I have my wax paper in place. I have the foam blocks built up behind the plaster rocks. So next, I will use some of that junk newspaper, get it wet, wad it up, fill in a bunch of cracks, and also give the terrain a little more shape. After that, put some plaster cloth down. I have my junk newspaper tore up, wadded up, put into place. So now I'm going to cut up some plaster cloth and lay that over this newspaper and give this corner area a little bit of shape. I'm going to try to bring this plaster cloth down to the edge of these castings, but I'm going to have to use some plaster to fill in these small gaps. The corner terrain has a shape now. Got all the plaster cloth laid in. So I'll let this dry overnight, and then tomorrow I'll start putting some plaster in and filling the gaps up. I've started applying plaster in the rocks over here, and then I thought, I'm going to redo this area right in here. So I've added a rock face here and a bit of one here, and this will taper into dirt over here. So I'm kind of building this up. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of small pieces glued together here. So what I need to do next is fill in the gaps with junk newspaper, and then I can fill in with plaster. And the same over here, I have a number of smaller castings glued together. And the same thing, all the gaps will have to be filled in with plaster. But I think this will look pretty nice once it's all finished. I've done some work in the canyon bottom, and I've added all this rock work. I got all the plastering done. Now these are actual rocks, as you can see. They'll get painted. I thought they'd look good down here. Got this rock in. This part would be painted granite, and this would be painted the yellow. Have this rock in. And I also raised up this riverbed. It used to had a real deep V, and I didn't like that. So I raised it all up. I think that looks pretty good. Now, I don't know what I'm going to do with that. I think it depends on how flat this is. If it's pretty flat, I could do a pour. If it's not, it'll just have to be a dry bed. Well, I started doing the plaster on these rocks, and I got sidetracked with all this stuff. So I guess I better get back to doing the plaster up here. I have the plaster done inside the rock castings. Now some of these areas here I'm not going to fill in, I'll just leave those dark. But everything else is filled in, ready for paint. But before I paint, I think I'm going to start working on the retaining wall. So go all the way back there. So what I've made here is a mold of sorts. I'm going to pour plaster in these areas, and these are 2 1/4 inches wide, and so I'll have 3 long pieces of plaster, retaining wall, and I can just, cut them to length as I need to. First, need to get them laid up. I'm going to use some Hydrocal. I'll mix it up, pour it in my mold. Now this sheet is like a silicone rubber sheet, so plaster won't stick to it. I have my Hydrocal poured, so I'm going to let this sit up pretty much all day. And you see where I've shaken the molds here, gotten the air bubbles to come up to the top. And that is really important. Whenever you pour plaster, you have to give the mold a good shake. Get that air to come up to the top. I removed the weather stripping mold that I used to lay up these long retaining wall pieces. You can see the back side of the surface here. If we flip it over, it looks absolutely flawless. So, making sure we get the air out of the plaster, we end up with absolute beautiful castings. These things are gorgeous. These are going to make some great retaining walls. I'll start using these plaster pieces I laid up. What I'll probably do is measure a certain length, cut, measure a length, cut. I've cut up some of those plaster walls that I laid up into 4-inch sections. I'm using hot glue, gluing them in place, and afterwards I'll come in and I will add the columns. I have my retaining wall in place, I have the columns in place. It goes way back over to there. And surprisingly, I had just enough material. How often does that happen? Well, now I'm going to use this piece of foam and my knife. I'm going to cut up some foam to lay down in behind this retaining wall. Well, I put pink foam in behind the retaining wall, so I have the retaining wall supported. And the next thing I need to do is tear up some junk newspaper and then fill in here, create some shape to the terrain, and then after that I'll put the plaster cloth in place. And that's pretty exciting because I'm looking forward to this area taking shape. Well, I have my plaster cloth in place, and I have my retaining walls backfilled, which is pretty exciting. Now all this stuff needs to dry overnight, but it is pretty exciting because I'm getting close to paint. This video's getting long, so I'm going to end it here, but man, a lot of progress here in the canyon. Got these rocks, got those rocks, got all this plaster cloth, got all this filled in here, got this retaining wall in place. Got these rocks in place. Even used a couple real rocks. So, a lot going on. So I thank you for watching. And I hope you come back as I continue work in what I'm now calling the North Canyon.